The sound was not a knock, but a splintering crack, the brutal punctuation of a heavy boot against pine wood. It was the sound of a world ending. The cabin door, Hannah's only shield against the raging Dakota blizzard, flew inward on a single hinge, a wounded bird with a broken wing. A blast of wind sharp with ice, and the scent of pine screamed into the small room, extinguishing the single tallow candle and plunging the world into a chaos of howling darkness and swirling snow. Hannah Rose Crane, startled from a fitful sleep in the hearth's weak warmth, scrambled to her feet, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Her first instinct, primal and absolute, was for her daughter. She snatched the swaddled bundle from the makeshift cradle, pulling 3-week-old Lily tight against her chest. The infant let out a thin, startled wail, a sound swallowed by the storm's fury. 2 figures filled the doorway, black silhouettes against the blinding white of the blizzard. They were massive, their shoulders broad beneath thick buffalo coats, their faces obscured by the shadows of wide-brimmed hats caked with snow. "What? Who are you?" Hannah's voice was a tremor barely audible. "What do you want?" The taller of the 2 men stepped forward, his boots crunching on the splintered wood of the door. He moved with a languid, predatory grace that was more terrifying than any hurried aggression. As he came closer to the faint, resurrected glow of the embers, his face came into view. It was a face carved from granite, an unforgiving winter's Silas Blackwood. The cattle baron whose sprawling ranch bordered her small plot of land, the man who had offered to buy her out with a smile that never reached his cold, slate-gray eyes. "Good evening, Mrs. Crane," he said, his voice a low-cultured purr that was grotesquely out of place amid the violence. "I'm afraid your hospitality has run its course. It's time for you to leave." Behind him, the other man, a hulking brute with a vacant expression, moved toward her. Hannah stumbled backward, clutching Lily so tightly the baby squirmed. "Leave. It's the middle of the night. There's a blizzard. We'll die." Blackwood's smile widened, a bloodless slash in the firelight. The Dakota Territory is known for its harsh judgments. Some are simply delivered by the weather instead of a man in a black robe. "Now be a good girl and step outside." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Hannah's confusion. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an eviction. It was a death sentence. The brutish man lunged his calloused hands, grabbing her arm. She cried out a raw sound of terror and tried to twist away, shielding Lily with her body. But he was impossibly strong, his grip a manacle of iron. He dragged her, stumbling and pleading, toward the gaping maw of the doorway. As she was forced across the threshold, her fingers numb with cold, and fear instinctively fumbled at her throat, closing around the familiar cold weight of the silver locket that hung there. It was a smooth oval piece, warmed only by the heat of her skin. Her father's last gift. The icy shock of the blizzard hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. The snow was a blinding, suffocating curtain, the wind a relentless beast tearing at her thin nightdress. As the brute shoved her forward, sending her sprawling into a snowdrift, her mind, fractured by terror, fled. The locket in her fist became an anchor to another time. She was a girl again, standing in her father's quiet leather and mahogany study in Boston. Judge Elias Crane, a man whose presence filled any room, was holding the locket in his palm. His face, usually set in lines of stern jurisprudence, was softened by a rare tenderness. "This world is built on laws, Hannah Rose." He had said, his voice a deep, comforting baritone. "But beyond the cities, out in the territories, the laws are fainter. Men like Silas Blackwood write their own. Be careful. Your husband Thomas is a good man, but he is a dreamer. That land he has purchased, it will test you." He had fastened the chain around her neck, his large, warm hands gentle. This will keep me close. Remember who you are. You are a crane. We do not break. A raw gust of wind ripped her back to the horrifying present. The memory shattered. Her father was gone, buried under a cold Boston winter 2 years ago. Thomas, her dreamer, was gone too, taken by a fever just a month after they'd finished the cabin, leaving her a widow in a land that was as alien as the moon. And now the cabin, their only legacy of hope, was being stolen from her. The door slammed shut with a deafening finality, the sound of a tomb being sealed. The faint rectangle of orange light vanished, leaving her utterly alone in the roaring, indifferent white. Lily began to cry in earnest, her wails thin and desperate against the storm's symphony of destruction. Hannah, on her hands and knees in the snow, pulled the baby's blanket tighter, her own body a fragile, shivering shield. She looked up at the churning, featureless sky. Her father's words echoed a cruel irony in the frozen air. We do not break. She was already broken. She was a ghost in a maelstrom with nothing left but a dying infant and the cold, silver memory of a world that no longer existed. Survival was a fight, but as the snow began to bury her, it felt more like a prayer that had already gone unanswered. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of white. There was no up or down, no earth or sky, only the biting wind and the relentless assault of snow. Hannah crawled, driven by an instinct she didn't know she possessed. Every movement was an agony. The snow was a physical weight, a grasping hand pulling her down. It filled her mouth, her eyes, and clung to her nightdress, which was now a brittle shroud of ice. Lily's cries had softened to a weak, intermittent mewling. The sound was a knife in Hannah's heart, more painful than the freezing cold that had leached all feeling from her limbs. She had to find shelter. An overhang, a dense thicket of pines, anything. But the landscape was a shapeless white desert, and the wind sculpting razor-sharp ridges in the snowdrifts that seemed to stretch into infinity. The moon was a prisoner behind a wall of impenetrable cloud. Her mind, struggling against the encroaching lethargy of hypothermia, kept snagging on the past. Thomas, his face alight with passion, unrolling the deed to their land on the dining table back in Boston. 160 acres, Hannah, with a creek running right through it. The Clearwater Creek. We'll build our house on the rise, and we'll watch the sun set over our own domain. He had been so full of life, so certain of the future. He couldn't have known that the Clearwater Creek was the very thing that made their land a target for a man like Blackwood, whose thousands of cattle were dying of thirst in a dry year. Her father's warnings intertwined with Thomas's dreams. Blackwood doesn't follow the law, he is the law out there, Judge Crane had cautioned. He has bought the judges, the sheriffs, the land commissioners. He will see your deed not as a right, but as an inconvenience. At the time, it had sounded like the overcautious fears of a city man. Now it was a prophecy fulfilled in the most brutal way imaginable. She stumbled, her knee striking a half-buried rock. Pain, sharp and blinding, shot up her leg, but it was a welcome sensation, a reminder that she was still alive. She huddled over Lily, trying to use the last of her body heat to warm the tiny, still form. "It's all right, my love." She whispered, her words freezing on her lips. "Mama's here. Mama will find a way." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The land she had traveled so far to claim, the land that was supposed to be her family's legacy, was now her executioner. Her hope had curdled into a bitter despair. Silas Blackwood hadn't just taken her home. He had taken her future, her past, and was now stealing the very breath from her lungs. He was erasing her. Just as a deep, seductive blackness began to creep into the edges of her vision, a shape emerged from the blizzard. At first, she thought it was a tree, or perhaps a mirage conjured by a freezing mind. But it moved. It was tall and broad, moving with a silent, deliberate purpose that seemed to defy the storm itself. It was not one of Blackwood's men. This figure was different, wrapped in furs and animal hides, a long rifle held in the crook of one arm. As it drew closer, Hannah could make out a face weathered and severe, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed to hold the ancient patience of the mountains. His long black hair was braided and whipped about his face by the wind. He was Sioux, a warrior. Fear, a new and different kind, lanced through her. She had heard the stories in the frontier towns, tales of brutal raids and unforgiving savagery, stories told by frightened settlers who saw the Sioux not as people, but as obstacles to be removed. She clutched Lily tighter, expecting a swift, violent end. The warrior stopped a few feet from her, his dark eyes taking in the scene, the half-frozen woman in a tattered nightdress, the impossibly small bundle in her arms, the tracks leading from the distant, faint silhouette of a cabin. He didn't speak. He simply watched his expression, unreadable, as inscrutable as the storm itself. This was it, then. The end would come not from the cold, but from the hand of the very people whose land she had come to occupy. The bitter irony was not lost on her. In a final desperate act, she held Lily out to him, a silent, hopeless plea. "Please, my baby. She's—" The warrior's gaze dropped to the infant. For a long moment, the only sound was the shriek of the wind. Then, with a slow, measured movement, he knelt. He reached out, not with a weapon, but with a fur-swathed hand, and gently pushed back the blanket from Lily's face. He looked at the tiny blue-tinged features, the faint puff of breath that misted in the frigid air. His name was Maddo, and he was a war chief of the Oglala Lakota. He was on a lone hunt, seeking not game, but solitude to wrestle with the anger in his heart. The settlers, the Wasichu, were pouring into the Black Hills, their iron horses screaming across the plains, their treaties as fragile and worthless as autumn leaves. His people were being starved, pushed onto smaller and smaller parcels of barren land. Mistrust for the white man was etched into his soul, a lesson taught by generations of betrayal. Yet as he looked at this child, this impossibly vulnerable life, the politics of his people and hers faded into the wind. He saw not a settler's baby, but a child on the verge of crossing over to the spirit world. His own son had been taken by the coughing sickness 2 winters past. The memory was a fresh wound, a raw and aching void. To leave this child to the storm would be to betray his son's memory, to dishonor the Great Spirit who gave all life. He made a choice, a dangerous choice, that went against the counsel of his elders and the bitter wisdom of his tribe. He scooped the woman and her child into his arms. Hannah was terrifyingly light, her body limp and barely conscious. He wrapped them both in his own heavy buffalo robe, a cocoon of warmth against the storm's fury. As he turned his back to the wind and began the long, arduous trek toward his winter camp, Hannah, drifting in a haze of cold and delirium, felt a moment of profound disbelief. She had been cast out by one man, only to be saved by another. She had been taught to fear. In the heart of the unforgiving Dakota Territory, under the eye of a merciless blizzard, she had stumbled into a conflict far older and more complex than a simple dispute over land and water. She had fallen into the gray space between 2 worlds, and now her survival and Lily's depended entirely on the mercy of a man who had every reason to leave her to die. The journey to the Sioux camp was a fever dream. Hannah drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the rhythmic crunch of snow under heavy footfalls and the enveloping musky warmth of the buffalo robe. She was vaguely aware of a change in the wind's howl, a muffling of its roar as they entered a sheltered coulee where the pines grew thick and tall, their snow-laden branches forming a protective canopy. The camp was a small, hidden village of teepees, their smoked hides glowing like soft lanterns against the blizzard's gloom. The sight should have terrified her, but she was too weak for fear. Mato carried her directly to the largest teepee, the flaps of which were pushed aside by a waiting figure. Inside, the air was warm and thick, with the scent of wood smoke, roasting meat, and drying herbs. Mato laid her down gently on a bed of soft furs near the central fire pit. A woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles. Her silver hair in 2 long braids immediately came to her side. This was Mato's mother, an elder whose eyes held a wisdom that seemed as old as the plains themselves. She clucked her tongue, a sound of deep concern, and began to work with practiced efficiency. She took Lily from Hannah's arms, unwrapping the frozen blankets and chafing the baby's tiny limbs with a surprising gentleness. Another woman brought warm broth, which Aye carefully spooned between Hannah's cracked blue lips. The warmth spread through her, a painful tingling sensation, as life began to seep back into her frozen tissues. But warmth and safety did not bring peace. As Hannah's strength slowly returned over the next few days, she became acutely aware of her precarious position. She was an outsider, a ghost at the feast. While Mato and Aye treated her with a quiet, reserved kindness, others were not so welcoming. Warriors would stare at her, their faces hard and unforgiving. Women would fall silent as she passed, their whispered words in the Lakota tongue like the rustle of dry leaves. She was a living symbol of the threat to their existence, a reminder of the endless tide of settlers encroaching on their ancestral lands. One warrior in particular, a young man named Kanga, whose eyes burned with a fierce, angry fire, made no secret of his contempt. "She is a snake we have welcomed into our lodge," he said one evening, his voice loud enough for all in the council teepee to hear. He was speaking to Mato, but his words were for everyone. "The Wasatchu speak with forked tongues. They take our land, kill the buffalo, and bring sickness. This one is no different. Her presence here brings danger." Mato, his face impassive in the flickering firelight, did not rise to the bait. "I found a mother and child dying in the storm," he replied, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of steel. "The Great Spirit does not ask the nation of the rabbit before telling the eagle to spare it. It was my choice. She is under my protection." The matter was settled for now, but the tension remained as thick and suffocating as the winter air. Meanwhile, in the fledgling frontier town of Redemption, a day's ride from the Sioux camp, Silas Blackwood was tightening his grip. The town was little more than a muddy main street, lined with a dozen false-fronted buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, and a sheriff's office that served as the seat of Blackwood's power. Sheriff Brody was a man hollowed out by fear. He was thin and stooped, with a drooping mustache that failed to hide the perpetual tremor in his lip. Blackwood had purchased his badge, his loyalty, and what was left of his soul years ago. Blackwood sat in Brody's office, warming his hands by the pot-bellied stove, the picture of calm authority. "The woman is gone," he stated, not asked. "My deputy found the cabin empty," Brody stammered, avoiding Blackwood's gaze. "Tracks were gone in the blizzard. No one could have survived that." "Do not mistake me for a fool," Brody Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a silken threat. "Hannah Crane is resilient. I want her found. I want the child. More importantly, I want the deed she carries. It is the last loose end. Put the word out. $100 for any information. I want every trapper and trader from here to the Bighorns looking for her." $100, Brody paled. "That's a fortune. People will do as they are told." Blackwood finished, rising to his feet. He walked to the window and stared out at the snow-choked street. He was a patient man. He had been planning this for years. He had systematically acquired every parcel of land touching the Clearwater Creek, using threats, blackmail, and violence disguised as accidents. The Crane property, inherited by a naive widow from the East, was the final crucial piece. he would not be denied by a stubborn woman and a blizzard. He would burn the entire territory to the ground to get what he wanted. His men, a collection of hard cases and hired guns, were already spreading his influence, ensuring that every ear in redemption listened for whispers of a woman and a baby who had vanished into the snow. The net was being cast. Back in the Sioux camp, Hannah knew she could not remain a guest, a burden forever. Guided by EA, she began to learn the rhythms of their life. Her hands, soft and accustomed to Boston parlors, became calloused and capable. She learned to scrape hides, to sew with an awl and sinew, to find edible roots beneath the snow, and to understand the silent language of the plains. She learned that survival was not a desperate, frantic scramble, but a quiet, steady rhythm of work and respect for the land. EA was a patient teacher. She spoke little English, but her gestures and the look in her eyes conveyed more than words ever could. Through her, Hannah began to see the world differently. She saw the interconnectedness of the buffalo and the grass, the wind and the spirit, the people and the earth. She saw the deep, abiding strength of a community bound together by tradition and a shared struggle. Yet the desire for justice burned within her. It was a low, steady flame that the kindness of her hosts could not extinguish. She could not let Blackwood win. She could not let him erase her and, by extension, Thomas. Her land was more than just soil and water. It was the last tangible piece of her husband, the physical manifestation of his dream. One evening, as she sat mending a moccasin by the fire, Maddow spoke to her. "The anger in you is a strong fire," he said, his voice quiet. "It can warm you or it can consume you. He took everything from me." Hannah replied, her voice thick with emotion. "My home, my husband's legacy. He tried to kill my daughter." "He is a man with a hollow spirit," Maddow said. "Such men try to fill the emptiness by taking from others. But you cannot fight him from here. To fight a man like Blackwood, you must understand him. You must find his weakness." His words solidified a desperate plan that had been forming in her mind. She had to go to redemption. She had to find a way to fight Blackwood on his own terms. It was a terrifying prospect. She would be walking into the spider's web, but staying in the camp safe but powerless was no longer an option. She was a crane, and cranes did not break. They fought back. A few days later, under the cover of a moonless night, wrapped in a borrowed buckskin tunic and with her hair braided to disguise her appearance, Hannah slipped out of the Sioux camp. She carried Lily, now healthy and quiet, strapped to her back in a cradle board E had made. Maddow had provided her with a horse and directions, his face grim but understanding. He knew he could not stop her. The fire he had seen in her was now a controlled burn, a focused, determined flame. Her journey to redemption was not just a quest for justice. It was a journey to discover who she had become. Redemption was a town suffocating in fear. Hannah felt it the moment she rode down the muddy, rutted main street. Men averted their eyes. Conversations in front of the general store dropped to hushed whispers as she passed, and the air itself seemed thick with suspicion. Blackwood's influence was a poison that had seeped into the very soil. She left her horse at the livery, paying the stable hand with one of the few coins she had sewn into the hem of her dress. With Lily secure on her back, she walked with a purpose. She did not feel her heart pounding against her ribs. She entered Abernathy's general store, the bell above the door announcing her arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt utterly out of place. The store was a cluttered haven of civilization, smelling of coffee beans, cured leather, and dust. Mr. Abernathy, a small bird-like man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his ledger. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly as he took in her appearance. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice a nervous flutter. I need to file a claim with the land commissioner's office, Hannah said, keeping her voice low and steady. It was a lie, a pretense to access the town's records. Abernathy polished his spectacles with a corner of his apron, stalling. Commissioner's office is closed for the time being. The commissioner had to travel back east on family business. He couldn't meet her eyes. I see, Hannah said, undeterred. Perhaps you could help me then. I'm a researcher documenting the history of land ownership in this territory. I need to look at the old plat maps and deeds from, say, the last 10 years. This was a more difficult request to refuse directly. Abernathy wrung his hands. The records are in the sheriff's office, in the back room. Sheriff Brody. He doesn't like people poking around. I'm sure the sheriff is a reasonable man, Hannah said, a cold edge to her tone. She knew from Maddow that Brody was Blackwood's puppet. This was a calculated risk. She found Sheriff Brody in his office, feet propped on his desk, looking as if the weight of his own badge were too much to bear. He listened to her request with a weary disinterest that quickly soured into suspicion when she mentioned the name Crane. The Crane plot, he grunted, sitting up. That land's in probate. Widow and child presumed dead in the blizzard. A tragic story, Hannah said smoothly, her heart seizing. I'm a distant cousin trying to settle the estate's affairs. I need to see the original deed and the adjacent land sale records. Reluctantly, and with a visible sheen of sweat on his brow, Brody led her to a small, dusty back room filled with overflowing shelves of ledgers and rolled-up maps. Don't make a mess, he mumbled before retreating to his desk. Hannah's hands trembled as she began to work. She untied the ribbon on the plat map for her quadrant. There it was, Section 12, 160 acres, with the Clearwater Creek snaking through it. And all around it, in every direction, was land owned by one entity, Blackwood Cattle Company. She began pulling the ledgers, working her way backward through the years. The sales had all happened within the last decade. One by one, the original homesteaders had sold out to Blackwood. Some entries were simple transactions. Others were followed by ominous notes in the margins, foreclosure abandoned, and next to one name, deceased. A pattern of predatory acquisition began to emerge. But it was a name in a ledger from 10 years prior that made her stop. It was a criminal docket mistakenly shelved with the land records. A case of cattle rustling. The defendant was a young man, barely 20 years old, Elias Miller. The details were sparse, but the verdict was clear guilty. The sentence, 10 years in the federal prison at Yuma, a place from which few men returned. And at the bottom of the page, in stark, unforgiving script, was the name of the presiding official visiting federal judge Elias Crane. Her father. Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. It couldn't be a coincidence. Miller. The name felt familiar, but she couldn't place it. She frantically searched for more. In another ledger, a manifest of business licenses, she found what she was looking for. The Blackwood Cattle Company had been incorporated 9 years ago. Its founder and sole proprietor was listed as Silas Miller. He had changed his name. Silas Blackwood was Elias Miller's brother. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. This was never about water rights. It wasn't about greed. It was a vendetta. A cold, meticulous 10-year plot of revenge. Her father, a man who saw the world in the rigid black and white of the law, had sent Silas's younger brother to a living hell. In his grief and rage, Silas had remade himself, taking the name Blackwood and dedicating his life to a singular, twisted purpose: to dismantle Judge Crane's legacy piece by painful piece. He had come to the Dakotas, the place where the supposed crime occurred, and begun to systematically destroy the very idea of law and order her father cherished. He bought the land, the lawmen, the politicians. He had become the thing her father had warned her about, a man who was the law. And she, Hannah Rose Crane, and her infant daughter were not just an obstacle. They were the final pieces of his revenge. They were the last living remnants of Judge Elias Crane. He didn't just want her land. He wanted to see her name, her bloodline, extinguished from the earth, to die helpless and alone on the very land her family had claimed. The cold that washed over her had nothing to do with the winter outside. It was the chilling recognition of an evil far more personal and profound than she had ever imagined. Her quiet investigation had not gone unnoticed. As Hannah hurried out of the sheriff's office, her mind reeling, Brody was already sending a rider to Blackwood's ranch. The cousin from the east was asking too many questions. The knowledge changed everything. The confrontation was no longer a distant possibility, but an imminent, terrifying certainty. Blackwood was not a man who would allow his secrets to be threatened. Hannah returned to the livery to find her horse gone. The stable hand, a boy no older than 16, refused to meet her eye. Sheriff's orders, he mumbled, fiddling with a piece of tack. Said the horse was evidence in an ongoing investigation. Trapped. The town was a cage, and the bars were closing in. Hannah pulled her borrowed tunic tighter, clutching Lily, and slipped into the alley behind the general store, her mind racing. She had to warn Maddow. She had to get back to the camp. Her chance never came. As she peered around the corner of the building, she saw them, Blackwood and 3 of his men, riding into town. They moved with an arrogant swagger, as if they owned the very air. But they weren't looking for her. They rode past the main street and headed toward the low hills that led into Sioux territory. A dreadful premonition seized her. He wasn't just coming for her. He was escalating. He was taking the fight to the people who had given her shelter. Her fears were realized hours later. A frantic rider from a nearby trading post, a man who did business with both the settlers and the Sioux, thundered into redemption. His face was pale with shock. He found Sheriff Brody in the saloon. "It's Blackwood," the trader gasped. "He rode into the Sioux winter camp. There was a scuffle. He's taken a hostage. A boy." Blackwood's cruelty was as strategic as it was profound. He had not chosen a warrior, which would have sparked an immediate bloody reprisal. He had taken a child, a 10-year-old boy, named Chayton Maddow's own nephew. He had ripped the heart out of the community and was now holding it for ransom. The ultimatum was delivered to the camp by one of his retreating men, the woman Hannah Crane, in exchange for the boy. If she was not delivered to him in redemption by sunrise, he would not only kill the boy, but would return with his full force and burn the winter camp to the ground, slaughtering everyone he found. The news carried back to the camp by a scout fell like a death shroud. The tribe was plunged into an impossible crisis. In the Central Council teepee, the air was thick with grief, fear, and recrimination. Kanga, the young hot-headed warrior, his face a mask of fury, pointed a trembling finger at the empty space where Hannah's furs had been. "I warned you," he spat at Maddow. "I told you the Wazachu was a snake. Now she has led the wolf to our door. Your weakness has cost us your own blood." The elders murmured in agreement. Their duty was to the tribe, to the preservation of their people. The choice, while agonizing, was clear to them. They must sacrifice the outsider to save one of their own and protect the many. But Maddow stood firm, his face like carved stone. He looked at his mother, Iye, who held the weeping mother of the kidnapped boy. He looked at the fearful faces of his people. He had brought this upon them. His code of honor, his single act of mercy in the storm, had led to this catastrophe. Blackwood is the wolf, Mato said, his voice resonating with a quiet, unshakable authority. The woman is not the cause of his hunger. He would have come for us eventually. He wants all of this land. He wants us gone. Giving him the woman will not satisfy him. It will only show him that we are weak, that we can be broken by fear. He has Chaitan Kang roared. He will kill him. And if we give him the woman, he will kill her, Mato countered. And then he will come for us anyway, when our spirit is broken and our honor is lost. No, we do not trade lives. We do not bow to monsters. We will face him. We will bring the boy home. And we will stand with the woman who has become our responsibility. It was a declaration of war. He was choosing to stand with a lone outsider against a powerful enemy, risking the complete annihilation of his people. It was a choice born not of strategy, but of character. He would not sacrifice one innocent person to save another. He would not become the thing he was fighting. He would honor his personal code, even if it meant their end. The decision was made. Mato and a handful of his best warriors would ride for redemption. They would ride into the heart of the storm. The blizzard returned with a vengeance, as if summoned by the darkness in men's hearts. It descended upon redemption, without warning, a swirling, shrieking vortex of white that erased the world. The wind tore at the wooden buildings, and snow began to pile in great drifts against doors and windows, trapping everyone inside. The saloon was the town's only sanctuary and its prison. Blackwood had herded 20 people inside Sheriff Brody, Mr. Abernathy, the blacksmith, a few frightened ranchers, and the saloon girls. He held them hostage, his men posted at the door, and windows their rifles ready. The kidnapped boy Chaitan sat silently in a corner, his eyes wide with a terror that had frozen his tears. The atmosphere inside was thick with the smell of stale whiskey, fear, and wet wool. The only light came from a few flickering oil lamps that cast long dancing shadows, turning familiar faces into grotesque masks. The only sounds were the howl of the wind, the groan of the building's wooden beams under the strain, and the loud rhythmic ticking of a large clock on the wall. Each tick was a hammer blow, counting down the seconds to sunrise, to the moment of Blackwood's promised retribution. Blackwood himself was preternaturally calm. He stood by the bar, sipping a whiskey, a portrait of patient, calculating evil. He knew Hannah was in town. He knew she would come for the boy. And she did. She had seen Mato and his warriors ride in just before the storm hit, ghosts materializing from the snow. They had found her huddled in the abandoned blacksmith shed. There was no time for words, only a shared look of grim understanding. Mato laid out a swift, desperate plan. A crash of glass from a side window shattered the saloon's tense quiet. One of Blackwood's men cried out and fell, an arrow protruding from his neck. Before anyone could react, the back door burst open, and Mato was inside a whirlwind of buckskin and righteous fury. His warriors followed, moving with a fluid, deadly grace. At the same instant, Hannah kicked open the swinging front doors, a rifle leveled in her hands. The element of surprise was total. The saloon erupted into chaos. Blackwood Hannah's voice cut through the pandemonium, clear and strong. Silas Blackwood turned slowly, a look of almost academic interest on his face. He saw her standing there, no longer the terrified, half-frozen victim he had thrown into the snow, but a woman forged into something new, something hard and dangerous. "Ah, Mrs. Crane," he said, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his lips. "You've come to witness the final act of a long and very personal play. It's fitting that you should be here." He ignored the tense standoff, the guns drawn, the silent, deadly dance of Mato's warriors moving into position. He gestured to the room. "All of this, all these years, has been for him, for my brother Elias." He began to speak, his voice a mesmerizing, chilling soliloquy against the backdrop of the raging storm. He told them of his brother, a boy of 19, full of life, who had made the mistake of falling in with the wrong crowd. He had been accused of rustling a charge trumped up by a rival rancher. The evidence was flimsy, the witnesses coerced. But your father, Judge Elias Crane, he didn't see a boy. Blackwood said, his voice dripping with a venom that had been fermenting for a decade. He saw a line in a law book. He saw a chance to make an example, to bring his stern Boston justice to the savage West. He spoke of principles and order. He sentenced my brother to 10 years in Yuma, which he knew was a death sentence. Elias lasted 2. The letter I received said he died of consumption. The guard I paid told me the truth. He died from a beating alone and broken in a cage. He took a step toward her, his eyes burning with a mad, grief-stricken fire. Your father murdered my brother with a gavel and a quill. So I swore an oath on Elias's unmarked grave. I would come here to the place where his life was stolen, and I would unmake everything your father believed in. I would own the law. I would own the land. And then I would find what was left of Judge Crane's precious bloodline, and I would wipe it from the face of the earth. You and that child of yours are the final paragraph in my testament of hate. The raw, painful truth of his story hung in the air, a shocking, terrible clarity. For a moment, Hannah felt a flicker of something other than hatred for him, a sliver of understanding for the depth of his loss. She saw the broken man behind the monster. Her finger tightened on the trigger. Justice, revenge. The words blurred together. It was then that Maddow spoke his voice, cutting through Blackwood's hypnotic narrative. He had moved silently to Chayton's side, shielding the boy. My father was also killed by the white man's law. He said, his words quiet but heavy with authority. He signed a treaty. He could not read a treaty that gave away our hunting grounds for empty promises. When my people starved, he fought back. They called him a renegade, hunted him down, and hanged him in a fort 200 miles from the land of his ancestors. They called it justice. He looked from Blackwood to Hannah. My pain is no less than yours, he said to Blackwood. But I did not seek to become the monster that killed my father. I chose to lead my people, to keep our traditions alive, to build a future for our children. He then turned his gaze to Hannah. Vengeance is a fire that burns the hand that wields it. Do not let his poison become yours. The choice was laid bare before her. Justice or revenge, the path of ruin or the path of resilience. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, broken sound. How noble. But there is no future, only the paying of old debts. He raised his pistol, aiming not at Hannah, but at the boy Chayton. The world exploded. The ticking clock on the wall was drowned out by the deafening roar of gunfire. The saloon became a maelstrom of smoke, splintering wood in chaos. Hannah fired not from rage, but from a cold, clear certainty. Her shot went true. At the same moment, an arrow from Maddow's bow flew across the room. Blackwood staggered back, clutching his chest, a look of profound surprise on his face, before collapsing behind the bar. The gunfight was short, brutal, and decisive. When the smoke cleared, Blackwood's men were dead or wounded, and his reign of terror was over. The blizzard broke at dawn. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the shattered windows of the saloon, illuminating a scene of wreckage and exhaustion. The storm outside had passed, and with it, the storm inside the town of redemption. In the quiet aftermath, the truth of Blackwood's tyranny came to light. With his iron grip broken, people began to speak. Mr. Abernathy, his voice trembling but resolute, told the territorial marshal who arrived days later about the years of intimidation and blackmail. Sheriff Brody stripped of his badge, and his authority confessed everything detailing Blackwood's systematic corruption and the network of fear he had built. The wounded were tended to, the dead were buried, and the town took its first shuddering breath of freedom. A new understanding was forged in the crucible of that night. The settlers who had huddled in fear inside the saloon had witnessed the courage of Maddow and his warriors. They had seen Hannah Crane, a woman they had dismissed as a fragile outsider, stand against a monster to protect them all. The old lines of mistrust and fear, while not erased, were blurred. When Hannah helped E.A. and the other Sioux women tend to the wounded settler and Sioux alike, she was no longer seen as a threat, but as a bridge. A quiet respect born from a shared struggle for survival had taken root in the unforgiving Dakota soil. Maddow ensured the safe return of his nephew, but he and his people did not vanish back into the hills. They stayed long enough to ensure that a new fairer law would take hold in redemption. Months later, spring had come to the territory, breathing life back into the land. The plains were a sea of new green grass, dotted with wildflowers. The Clearwater Creek, the source of so much conflict, now gurgled peacefully, its water clear and life-giving. Hannah stood on the small bluff overlooking her cabin. The structure was no longer a fragile shelter, but a home solid and secure. A small vegetable garden was thriving, and the beginnings of a proper corral stood near the barn. The land was no longer a painful inheritance tied to a legacy of violence, but a future she had earned with her own 2 hands, a testament to her own strength. Lily, now a healthy, gurgling baby, sat at her feet, playing with a painted stone. From a leather pouch at her waist, Hannah took out the silver locket. It felt cool and heavy in her palm. For so long, it had been her only link to her father, a symbol of the life she had left behind, and the principles he had instilled in her. But she was no longer just Judge Crane's daughter. She was Hannah Rose Crane of the Dakota Territory. Her identity was not something she had inherited, but something she had forged in fire and ice. She walked to the base of a young cottonwood tree she had planted near the bluff's edge. She dug a small hole in the soft earth with her hands. She looked at the locket one last time, whispered a quiet, "Goodbye, Father," and placed it in the hole. As she covered it with dirt, she was not burying her past, but planting it, allowing it to become part of the roots of her new life, honoring it without being defined by it. As she straightened up and brushed the soil from her hands, she saw a figure on horseback, approaching from the valley below. It was Maddow. He rode not as a war chief or a savior, but simply as a friend. He dismounted and walked to her side, his presence as calm and steady as the land itself. He said nothing for a long moment, the two of them standing together, looking out at the vast, promising horizon. Then he held out his hand. In his palm lay a single perfectly formed eagle feather, its base wrapped in red-dyed quillwork. "For the one who flies with a strong heart," he said. It was a symbol of the highest honor among his people, a mark of courage and wisdom. Hannah accepted the gift, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you, Maddow," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, profound gratitude. "For everything." He simply nodded, a small smile touching his lips before mounting his horse and riding back the way he had come. Hannah held the feather, its delicate structure belying its incredible strength. She picked up Lily, holding her daughter close. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, casting a warm, golden light across the valley. She looked out at the endless plains, at the promise of the coming twilight and the dawn that would follow. She had faced the very worst of this wild, beautiful land, and had not only survived, but had found her true home. She was a woman of the West, her future as open and vast as the sky above her.